Many people know far too little about the topic of the Roma genocide. Who are the Roma people and why is so little known to the general public about what happened to them during the Holocaust?
Yeah. So Romani people are a very diverse set of people. They have many different religions. They have many occupations, ways of living. I think best known are groups that are itinerant and travel also as families for their occupation. That is true in part in Western Europe, in the US. Um, the majority of Roma already by the early 20th century would have been settled, um, living in houses, sometimes in rural areas, or indeed, eventually, cities were growing as well in the growing anonymous cities. And what we see here is a photo that reflects this type of studio photography of people who are representing themselves, I would say, in a new modern way. You asked me about what we don't know as well, why we don't know. And what is surprising is not just that we don't know about what happened to them in the Holocaust, because to some degree, that is the best known part of their history. And we perhaps don't even think about how little we know about them outside of that, outside of the history of mass killing. The largest ethnic minority of Europe, and they don't show up in textbooks, neither in the US nor in Europe, or in national histories or in national museums. They're profoundly ignored, and it's so profoundly marginalized overall that that really their marginalization doesn't even register for most people, I would say.
And hopefully we're doing a lot to combat that, with more and more research on the history, this part of the history and the history in general. But I'm also interested in another aspect of your work, Ari, and that is the novel approach you take to looking at Jewish experiences and Romani experiences in the same frame. Most people, when we talk about the experiences of different victim groups in the Holocaust, such as Roma, Jews, and there are others, we tend to put them in comparison with one another. But what you're doing in your work is different than that. You're really proposing a different approach, and you sometimes call it relational history. Elsewhere, you call it entangled history.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about what you mean by that?
Sure. So when we think of genocides, in the plural, genocides we know less about, I think the most common thing we do is to compare, draw historical analogies. And one of the way that comparison tends to work here is, for example, to ask about intention. How was the intention here? How was the intention there? It is another example would be how many people were killed. The problem here is really we need to understand the assumptions going into comparisons, and they are usually not investigated properly. So what do I propose? Also, basically as preparatory work for a proper comparison, but also beyond that, really. But what can we do then? I would say we don't just compare, but we actually try to see how members of two groups relate to each other. And when I say relate to each other, we really have to be expansive, because if we think of relationship as just something positive, when people identify with each other, then we're missing a lot of what relations are about, which are about actively ignoring each other, misunderstanding each other, being next to each other, not noticing each other, but really being so proximate that there is still a relationship there. And all of this, if you think about what happened to Jews, what happened to Roma during the war and afterwards, in those terms, you can start to tell a much more complicated history of both genocides, I think, actually. So what it allows, and another thing that it allows you to really do is you start to understand, you can start to relate to you can start to understand how we relate to the suffering of others. And that really was fundamentally for me one thing I wanted to understand, how we learn about the suffering of others.
Yes, this is why I find it so intriguing. So if I understand correctly, another way that Jewish and Romani experiences were entangled came out of the fact that Nazis forced them into some of the same places at the same time. Can you give us some concrete examples about how Jews and Roma encountered each other?
Sure. So Roma were present at various sites that we will know mostly from the persecution of Jews. And they were indeed usually established with the intent of persecuting Jews, such as ghettos, for example. So these closed, confined areas where you had dreadful hunger, overcrowding, and eventually deportations to their death. And one of the ghettos that I want to speak about is the Lodz ghetto, which is the second largest ghetto. And you can see here an image, actually, not just of the Lodz ghetto, but of the entrance to the so-called Gypsy ghetto or Gypsy camp or Roma camp in the Lodz ghetto. So in November 1941, the Nazis deported 5,000 Roma from Austria, from the province of Burgenland, to that ghetto. And in this subpart of the ghetto was particularly dreadful, without any proper sanitation. And it was administered, and here you can see interactions already. It wasn't just carved out of the Jewish ghetto, but really the Jewish self-administration, the Jewish council, was in charge of many crucial functions there, including supplying doctors, sanitation, and removal of corpses and such things. And Jewish ghetto police was responsible as well for one part of the perimeter towards the Jewish ghetto.
Yeah, so, in addition to the something like 200,000 Jews in this ghetto, also 5,000 Roma were forced into this ghetto. What do we know about the fates of the Jews and the Roma who ended up in the Lodz ghetto?
So the Roman inmates started dying in very large numbers, very rapidly. We think around 700 will have died within a few weeks, 700 of 5,000, and largely due to typhus, which broke out in the camp, due to precisely these unsanitary situation. And then after a month and a half or so, all the survivors were murdered in the Chelmno extermination camp. And this is really one of the first large groups to be killed in this camp. We don't actually have testimonies from Roma in this case, from any part of that deportation or their interactions with Jews, because they all died. We do, however, have testimonies from Jews. Testimonies that precisely speak about perceptions of suffering next to each other.
It reminds me of how you write in your work about how Jews and Roma recall their proximity to one another through sensory experiences, seeing each other, smelling each other, hearing each other. Can you talk about that aspect of their entangled experiences?
Yeah, so the senses are really one way one can think of interactions. So the Lodz ghetto, for example, in testimonies is largely about auditory experiences and auditory impressions. And what Jewish survivors mostly recount is a memory of horrible screams. So sounds they cannot actually interpret properly. For them, it wasn't actually clear even who was suffering there sometimes. They were speculating who these people might be. Other survivors would emphasize not just hearing, but also seeing and indeed smelling the demise of the other group. Auschwitz-Birkenau would be one place where this is prominent, and here it is actually Roma and Sinti who would give such testimonies. Their camp, which has the abbreviation B2E, so in Birkenau, was very close to the ramp where Jews were arriving, that infamous camp that was built in 1944, where starting in May, Hungarian Jews were also deported and then murdered in very large numbers. Roma had been forced, among other prisoners, to actually build build that ramp, much like Jews had been forced to build the camp where Roma were actually that Roma were in eventually. So what they could experience here, in spite of the Nazis' attempts to hide it, is they could see these people sometimes, and they would. So they are some of the last people seeing these Jews, last victims seeing these Jews alive. And finally, I would mention tactile experiences too, and these include experiences of dealing with each other's property, but also dealing with each other's bodies. And in one case where this overlaps is one that I found particularly haunting, which is the first account that really it's from the first account that reaches the Warsaw Ghetto about killings in Chelmno. And you already heard that these Roma from Lodz were killed in Chelmno, and indeed the account is precisely of this killings. When the Warsaw Ghetto learns of mass killings, it is partially a report on Roma, in fact. And what that report mentions is how there are Jews who are forced to dig pits where the Roma will be shot and buried, and it's January, it's cold, and these Jewish grave diggers put on the clothes of the people they are burying to warm themselves, and are subsequently shot. So these Jews take the Romani's clothing and are then killed on top of the other Romani victims. So what you can see here is a particular, perhaps one of the most tragic and immediate ways that these histories are indeed entangled.
The stories you're telling us are absolutely chilling. And yet it explains so much about the kinds of knowledge that we do have. Do you have other examples of how Roma and Jewish faiths were entangled in this period?
Yeah, so the examples I gave you so far are all from Eastern Europe. So let me turn west, and perhaps also to a different type of camp. And these are the so-called, some people call them transit camps, that existed in places like the Netherlands and Belgium, so Westerbork and Malines or Mechelen. And the video we have here is actually from the Dutch camp I just mentioned, Westerbork, and it's a unique document. It's actually a very long film, and usually shorter clips are shown from it. And it's a very famous clip of a deportation on May 19th, 1944, where we can also see how prisoners are boarding train cars to Auschwitz. And among this, in this film, what we'll see in a second, is also an image that is very often isolated and became famous. Starting with this note on here, 74 people are in it, and then this particular shot here of a girl in a deportation train staring out briefly. This haunting image of this. It's actually a 9-year-old girl looking out. And for so long, for again reasons that have to do with the assumptions we have when we see these types of images, people understood that this must be a Jewish girl, as most of the people deported from Westerbork were Jews, or nearly all, except that's not quite the case, and it's not the case for the deportation train on May 19th, 1944. And a journalist in the Netherlands by the name of Ad Wagenaar actually went out with the open question, like, who is this girl? He just wanted to figure out what the name of this girl is. And then he figured out that it's not a Jewish girl. It is a Romani girl by the name of Setela Steinbach. And so Setela Steinbach became a symbol of the Romani Holocaust, but more than that, because there is this history of a confusion, she became a symbol of how easily these stories are forgotten, how the Romani Holocaust can be hidden behind the Jewish Holocaust in some ways. And I guess what Wagenaar really shows us is how it's very often, if we start to ask new questions, how we can see things we haven't seen before.
Your research also goes beyond the war, looking at the history of survivors' quest for justice and for restitution afterwards. Can you tell us about some of the individuals who navigated this process?
Sure. So let me give you one example. And this actually, I'll start not with the people, but with a document that I found, which is how how historians very often encounter people. And it's a document that was absolutely surprising to me. So this is something that is now part of in the archive of the Jewish community of Vienna. Um, and it is produced by an organization called the Action Committee, which was founded by the Jewish community to help Jewish survivors. And they produced a whole lot of lists. So children of school age who had been in concentration camps is one of them. There are lists of stateless Jews who had benefited from U.S. food distribution campaigns. And there is a list also of prisoners who spent between 3 and 3.5 years in concentration camps and are now back in Vienna. And on that list is actually my grandmother, my paternal grandmother. And then, well, as you might expect from all of this, those lists are about Jews or people persecuted as Jews. Well, all except one list, and that is called the List of Gypsies Registered with Us. And it's a list of 33 Romani men and women, some of whose names I anonymized for privacy reasons. And I want to tell you about two of the people who uh, also have perished since, have died since. That's Adolf Gusak and Hermine Horvath, who were actually a couple and became a couple after the war. And both were clearly scarred by their experiences during the war. Their health was in tatters, their families decimated. Gusak lost his first wife and son. Horvath, her parents and four siblings in the camps. They also had nothing really to return to. Gusak didn't have much to begin with. He was raised as an orphan by a priest. Horvath's family had owned a tiny house in the Austrian province of Burgenland, but neighbors had taken it from them after the family was deported, and then it was not returned. And that, again, is actually a very typical experience. So this list was produced in the summer of 1946, which is precisely when members of, so not just these two people, but members of their extended family decided to sign up with an organization that was founded by the Jewish community to help Jewish survivors, this Action Committee. Why did they do that? Well, it was likely the quickest way to be recognized as a victim. This was the organization that would recognize victims of racial persecution, and most people thought of Jews when they heard that term. And there were no equivalent bodies formed by or for Sinti and Roma in the city or anywhere else for that matter, who could do the same work. So they ended up there.
So if a lot of this was about documentation, what does it mean for the historian? How did you go about reconstructing the histories of survivors like Horvath and Gusak and what they were, when they were searching for justice?
Well, Horvath and Gusak are great examples of the dynamics that I want to describe here too, which is not just these interactions right after the war, but indeed how we know about these stories. Because the reason I can tell you anything about them is because a Jewish archive is collected their testimony. And by Jewish archive here, I mean an archive created to recount and document the fate of the Jews, and the one that kept these in this case kept these documents is the Wiener Library in London, which is really the oldest institution to document persecution of Jews and then their destruction. They cared fairly early on about testimonies when many others actually didn't. Today we focus a lot on testimonies, and it's very hard for us to imagine how few people actually wanted to hear victim testimonies, including some victims who actually were keen on collecting perpetrator testimonies to prove their point, to make claims in court and in the court of history. The Wiener Library was a bit different there, and they had a very visionary research director by the name of Eva Reichmann, who was herself a German Jewish refugee. And she wasn't just visionary in collecting testimonies in general, she was also visionary in actually explicitly asking a person she hired in Vienna for Romani interviews. And this is here you can see what the interview looked like when it was typed up. Um, and you can see here the name of the person recording it and when it was recorded. Um, so why Jewish institutions? Again, that was not a coincidence. They were really among the first to have not just an interest to record Romani voices, but actually the capacity to do it. And it's something we very easily forget when we see a document like this, is how substantial the resources are to collect these types of testimonies and make them available. Because it's not just enough to have good intentions and to write down what somebody said, or today record. It's very easy for us these days to record what somebody said. You need to do it in an informed way. You need to then have it in a location where other interviews are being kept. They need to be indexed so that you can actually find them. And the institution where they're kept needs to be a sustainable institution. And that was actually not, all these things are not easy historically. It takes a lot of resources to keep these institutions alive. And many of them, actually, many of these Jewish institutions nearly went bankrupt and out of business, basically, and barely survived. Again, something we easily forget. So because it takes these these resources really to collect history, Jewish institutions were crucial, and Roma who did not have these institutions or resources really ended up relying ultimately on these Jewish institutions.
So the documentation itself becomes yet another level of entanglement that's part of your story. Would you provide us with an example, though, of some Roma survivors who were successful in their pursuit of compensation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I should say the biggest turning point for all of this is really the rise of the Romani civil rights movement. So it's really Roma self-organization. And I should also say, it sounds very abstract, but really the compensation, but also other rights the Romani civil rights movement had to fight incredibly hard to gain equality and recognition there, with all sorts of protests, including a hunger strike in the concentration camp Dachau, to which were part of an attempt to really be recognized, against incredible odds. For the purpose of this talk, I would emphasize also that there were these Jewish allies who were really crucial. And one person and one institution I would mention is the United Restitution Organization, which is a very large legal aid organization that is there to help Jews make claims against Germany, restitution claims, compensation claims. Like so many of these organizations, it started out early on, late 1940s, 50s, early 50s, somewhat cash-strapped. These are small endeavors, but they grow fairly rapidly. This is the man who actually runs their operation in Germany on the ground, from Frankfurt. His name is Kurt May. And Kurt May had at his disposal by 1958, just to give you a sense of this organization, a fairly large organization. They had 223 registered lawyers working for them, and they needed that many lawyers because they had 220,000 pending cases. So Kurt May himself was somebody who was troubled by the decisions made about the compensation for Roma. And in particular, he was troubled by one landmark decision that Germany's High Court of Appeals passed in 1956, which denied Romani applicants compensation for all deportations that happened before 1943. That is not automatic compensation. So anything that happened before they came to Auschwitz, basically, was not deemed per definition racial persecution. And that includes this image, which is also, I believe, on the announcement of this talk, which is a deportation. So here you see a deportation from the town of Asperg, which was sort of where Sinti and Roma were concentrated for this larger deportation of 2,000 German and Romani citizens from West Germany. So May 1940, there are these mass arrests. And German courts basically decided, unless you can actively prove otherwise, we will not presume that this counts as racial persecution. And if it doesn't count as racial persecution, Germany does not have to legally compensate the victims accordingly. And could May really manage to change that court practice? It was a long campaign. He ran it for several years. He was ultimately successful, and he did it by using the resources of his organization. So he could write to a historian, a well-known historian of the SS, actually, who wrote expert opinion on this. He had connections to a judge who was also a legal expert on these issues, who wrote an influential article. He collected material which he sent to courts, because these organizations had historians also on board as part of their legal aid work, which they needed. So there is a whole infrastructure there that he could use, and it's with that infrastructure really that the practice of Romani compensation payment was changed. And perhaps just one detail that I found fascinating is, again, how is this all funded? Here it's actually fees, the 3 to 7% fees that Jews had to pay to this legal aid organization for helping them recover their compensation, that went into changing really the compensation practices for Roma. So what we can see here really is another layer of entanglement between the people consciously connect these two groups and the people who are actually entangled in ways they don't even know, perhaps.
Ari, thank you so much for joining me tonight. We have learned so much, not only about the Roma genocide, which in itself is important, but also to this idea of entangled history, a methodology that allows us to move beyond strict comparison. For our purposes here at the USHMM, it was also really helpful to understand more about some of the materials in our collection, why they're sort of strange, and how to read them better. I hope knowing these materials are here and how they appear here will inspire other scholars to come and study this history.